afternoon. I'm Tamara Bond-Williams. Welcome to the New York Space Business Roundtable. We are honored by your presence. During the roundtable, you will be muted. However, the chat function is available for your comments and questions. We welcome you to make full use. Around 1 o'clock, we will direct our attention to any questions in the chats. As time is limited, we may not get to all of your questions, but if we are unable to address them during the roundtable, we are happy to send them off to the panelists after for follow-up. So with that, please do make good use of the chats. I'm going to take a moment now to acknowledge our supporting organizations and sponsors. We'll start with Empire Space, which is dedicated to comprehensively analyzing, supporting, promoting the entire New York space sector with the aim of fostering economic growth, promoting research and development, and increasing academic and commercial opportunities for the space sector for all New Yorkers of all backgrounds. We're grateful to have their support. The World Teleport Association has, since 1985, been the leading partner in the growth for teleport operators, advocating for their commercial interests and promoting excellence in their business practices, technology, and operations. We are also grateful for the friendly support of Space News. In print and on the web, Space News sets the authoritative standard for independent space journalism, astute analysis, and insightful commentary, including their segment, which is called Significant Digits, a version of which we are happy to share each month at the roundtable. Our sponsors are the Trade and Investment Office of Luxembourg in New York, which supports the expansion of business to Luxembourg and your entrance into European markets, as well as providing opportunities for Luxembourg-based businesses to set up and develop their activities in North America. Daruva Space Private Limited, based in Hyderabad, India, is an award-winning space technology company focused on building full-stack space engineering solutions and actively building application-agnostic satellite platforms. And finally, the sponsor for this quarter's topic is Astroscale, the first private company with a vision to secure the safe and sustainable development of space for the benefit of future generations, dedicated to on-orbit servicing across all orbits. Thank you to all of our supporting organizations and sponsors. With that, we are pleased to present our opening video, which hopefully sets the tone for our conversation. Many of the videos we show at the roundtable are from our library of videos highlighting the amazing human good that satellites provide. The website, bettersatelliteworld.com, is where you can find them, and they are available for your use. Today's video is underwritten by the Space Shuttle Children's Trust Fund.
Without risk, there can be no reward worth having. Space offers plenty of both. The risks begin the moment we set out, riding into space on a column of fire. Millions of systems and software codes have to work right to keep failure at bay. Reaching orbit, we find only vacuum filled with deadly heat, cold, and radiation. Everything we fly must operate and even support human life in a place where nothing can live. We can do it only because more than half a century of engineering experience goes with us, and that has made space a very rewarding place. A place where we do billions of dollars worth of business, something unimaginable at the dawn of the space age. A business whose potential may be as limitless as space itself. The old risks remain, and we have added new ones. For that same half-century, we've been littering the road to space with rocket engines, failed satellites, and broken equipment. Earth orbit holds almost 100 million pieces of debris moving at blazing speeds. A piece of junk may be no bigger than a softball, but can hit with the force of a bomb. When things collide in orbit, they make more debris. In just one incident, a failed Russian spacecraft smashed into a commercial satellite. In an instant, thousands more pieces of junk were added to the sky. We also keep launching satellites by the hundreds and thousands. The more we launch, the closer comes the day when Earth orbit could become a minefield that neither people nor machines dare enter. Without meaning to, we could close the road to our future forever. How can we keep it open? Government and industry are making new rules for spacecraft to stop adding to the threat. Success depends on cooperation between spacefaring nations. That's hard, but we've been doing it for decades. Companies and space agencies are testing ways to get rid of the most dangerous debris. It's incredibly hard, like catching a softball moving 20 times faster than the speed of sound. But the work goes on. Government and industry are building better radar systems to track debris. Automatic warnings will give operators time to move spacecraft out of the way, as the International Space Station does today. We are designing for a future of constant maneuvering in orbit that will test the ingenuity of engineers like nothing before. But that's hardly new. Space junk is just the latest risk we face on our long journey to the stars. If we tackle it with the same skill and dedication as those who came before us, generations to come will have the chance to travel an open road to limitless possibility. Space and satellite, the world's invisible, indispensable technologies. Brought to you by Space and Satellite Professionals International with the support of the Space Shuttle Children's Trust Fund.
So I thank you all for watching that video. This is the third and final installment of this quarter's theme, Commercial Space Infrastructure, titled Goldilocks Regulations for Space, or Nobody Told Me It Was Gonna Be a Bear. How much is too much? Too little? Enough? To help us explore these questions, we have an exceptional panel, starting with our guest moderator for today. Steve Kaufman is the co-head of the satellite practice at Hogan Lovells, as well as a partner in the corporate and finance practice. Steve uses industry knowledge and versatility to negotiate and close many types of deals globally. And for 18 of his 30 years at the firm, Steve has served as outside general counsel for satellite clients, leading strategic joint ventures, vet the company contracts, financings, and M&A. He is a longtime friend of SSPI and of the Roundtable, and we are grateful that he is stepping in for Lou Zaccarilla today. Crystal Hazelton is Director of Space Applications Programs at Secure World Foundation and has over 10 years of international and domestic space, public policy, and management experience. She was recognized in 2018 as one of the 20 under 35 young professionals representing the future of space and satellite. Crystal joins us a week after Secure World Foundation's immensely successful 5th Annual Space Sustainability Summit here in New York. And we are looking forward to her insights from that event and her broader experience. Thomas Lamanauskas took office as ITU's Deputy Secretary General on 1st January 2023. In this key elected role, he assists with organizational management and fosters close collaboration with ITU's radio communications, standardization, and development activities. Mr. Lamanauskas aims to forge impact-driven partnerships, help the industry cut emissions, and implement results-oriented management to ready ITU for a dynamic future. Abhishek Malhotra, founding partner of TMT Law Practice and a member of the Bar Councils of Delhi and California, has 2.5 decades of experience in the primary areas of expertise, including intellectual property, commercial dispute resolution, technology, media, and telecommunications. He has advised clients in minimizing legal risks and devising strategies for safeguarding against civil and criminal liability. He has contributed to the policy realm by providing inputs as the principal advisor to the Broadband India Forum on issues relating to, inter alia, to space satellite communications and data protection. And finally, at Willis Towers Watson, Rob Shiga is responsible for business development and client management in North America for all satellite launch vehicle and space technology accounts. He has expertise managing risk for satellites in both GEO and LEO, ranging from individual spacecraft to mega constellations. Rob is president of the Washington Space Business Roundtable, where he has served for more than 15 years in varying roles. He was named a future leader of the space industry in 2009 by SSPI and as a power broker by Risk and Insurance Magazine in 2015 and 2019. Also, he's an author of 3 novels, and also his video and was crisscrossed with Thomas's. So my apologies. But we will see them on screen very soon and get to know them. Before that, though, I'm happy to welcome again to the roundtable, Mr. Jason Rainbow. Jason has been with the roundtable since its very, very beginning. And in his current role as senior staff writer, he writes about satellite telecom, space finance, and commercial markets for Space News. Unfortunately, he will not be on camera, but I welcome you to the roundtable, Jason. Please take it away.
Thank you, Tamara. Yes, I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. Regulators are under a lot of pressure to keep up with the rapid pace of innovation in the space sector, to make sure that they're not holding back an unprecedented wave of proposed businesses, but at the same time, they need to act as guardians of sustainability to ensure the orbital operating environment is safe for everyone. So there's a lot of thought going in right now to develop these regulations. I thought I might do something a little bit differently. This time I'm going to give kind of a quick rundown of what the Federal Communications Commission is doing in this area to help paint a backdrop for the conversation you'll be having today, because they're really at the forefront of tackling this challenge. In April, the FCC officially established a standalone Space Bureau to spearhead its efforts to modernize satellite regulations. The restructuring essentially split the International Bureau of the FCC into 2 units, the Space Bureau and the Office of International Affairs, which will handle the FCC's work with foreign governments and international regulatory authorities more generally. But the idea is having a dedicated Space Bureau with more resources will help the regulator handle its increasing workload in the industry. It's being led by Julie Kearney, a law and policy veteran who was a special counsel for the FCC. And before that, she had spent decades at private legal practices and telecoms companies, including Loon, the balloon-based connectivity venture that Google's parent company ultimately canned in 2021. But one of the priorities she laid out when she took the role was to increase processing times for new satellites in response to the record demand. At the time, they said they were getting applications for more than 60,000. Yeah, applications for more than 60,000 new satellites were before the FCC, and mostly in non-geostationary orbit. I don't think they've really kind of moved. I haven't really heard much on that front yet, but a few weeks later, the FCC did adopt some new rules clarifying how operators in non-geostationary orbit that were awarded fixed satellite service licenses in different FCC application processing rounds must avoid interfering with each other. There are protections for the first movers, but these have a timeline to be phased out so they can't hold that advantage forever. And we also saw some new rules adopted in September that would shorten the time operators must remove defunct satellites in low Earth orbit from 25 to 5 years. I think the guests on this panel will know that the latest on that, but the last I checked, it was basically all good to go, but it was in something of a holding pattern while it clears some administrative issues. But all that to say that there is a step change at the FCC to move faster, to avoid hindering innovation, but to also do that in a sustainable way. And the new Space Bureau has, I know, talked a lot about how another one of its priorities is to help do that by collaborating more and being more transparent about its processes. And it's not just the FCC, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration recently said it takes now just 15 days to issue a commercial remote sensing license, which is down from around 50 to 100 days before they streamlined regulations in 2020. And internationally, I know the UK is also keen to build out new regulations for emerging space businesses that are and technologies that are tied to a sustainability focus. They very much want to be seen as the gold standard for that kind of thing. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how regulators worldwide strike that balance in the coming years and how companies react to it and navigate that landscape. So I'm hoping to learn more about that from your panel today. And yeah, it should be an interesting and timely discussion. And definitely looking forward to hearing more from Steve as well. Glad to have you here, Stephen, and sorry to miss Lou.
Well, with that, Steve, you're on.
I'm on. Well, hello all. Welcome to our panel. Our topic today is the Goldilocks of space regulation. And you've heard from our panelists. What I'm going to do is to bring up 6 topics and then go around to our various panelists. We have Crystal possibly representing the U.S. policy perspective, Tomas, the policy perspective of the ITU, Abhishek, worldwide space, but primarily India. And then we've got Rob, who's going to talk about sort of the risk management view, whether regulation, what that does to his risk management profile and the insurance he provides to customers. Our 6 areas I'm going to cover as quickly as we can: space communications, imaging, orbital debris, which was the subject of our video, in orbit manufacturing, refueling, and similar. Matters relating to other planets, asteroids, etc., and the general subject of human space travel. If our theme is we all know we need some regulation. Do we have too much regulation? And if so, what's too much about it? What should we change? Do we have not enough, or do we think it's just right? So looking over the next few years and what you think the regulators are going to do, what you'd like them to do. Let me start off with the subject of space communications, which I know Jason talked about in our intro, the new initiatives, and maybe Crystal, start with you and the FCC's new initiatives. Is this regulation that we need? Is it in the right areas? Is it too much? Is it not enough? Where should it go? Where will it go?
Well, yeah, that's a great update by Jason. So thank you for that. I think, as always, when it comes to the topic of what regulation is right and how do we support industry and sort of meet the needs of the countries, we have to start from sort of what countries are trying to do. And so typically it kind of falls into 3 buckets. Countries are attempting to protect national interests, national infrastructure, promote national security. Countries typically are also trying to meet their requirements under international law, as well as their general desire to commit to support sustainable space. So the idea that Secure World works on, which is this idea of maintaining an environment that is safe, secure, peaceful, and usable in the long term. And then finally, most countries will also sort of say, oh yeah, we also want to promote industry and money and generation of new activities in our borders and abroad. Where the emphasis falls on that can really depend, and it can vary from time to time. And so how much regulation you need sort of also to a certain extent depends on which aspect of those responsibilities and goals a country or a particular administration or even a particular division within that country is focused on. And so there's a lot of room for variation. When it comes to space communications, I think we've all seen that, the technology in space is continuing to advance, and there definitely is a need for that back and forth with government to come in to make sure that we're putting in place, the rules and regulations that are necessary to meet those needs that we've just discussed. And so when it comes to ways to do that, the recent innovation by the Space Bureau, I think, is generally a positive step. These sort of authorities are always going to fall within a number of branches. There's always concerns about coordination among them, but at the same time, different responsibilities definitely fall to different organizations within a government. And so seeing, a desire to build out expertise, to build out knowledge, to be transparent about what they're trying to do, those are all really positive. There's definitely questions about exactly what aspects of regulation fall within, for instance, the new Space Bureau, but might fall elsewhere within the United States government. So a lot of questions remain. But I was just hearing from the Space Bureau last week about sort of the philosophy that they're taking and really trying to take a very balanced approach. The United States is one of those countries that very much wants to promote the growth and expansion of space activities, both by US-led companies and others. And so I think there's a real conscientiousness about making sure that that is done in a way that's sustainable, but that in a way that is not overly heavy-handed. And so while this is a new development, so I think there's still a lot of questions. Overall, having more resources and more ability to understand the problems and then come up with the right solutions in consultation with industry and researchers and others, I think is really going to be key for moving forward.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Very much appreciated. Thomas, maybe you could offer us the international perspective, and I assume we'll have to caution all of us that these are your own views and not that of your agency. But we'd appreciate your perspective just the same. What are the initiatives? Do we have too much regulation, or do we need more? And if so, where?
So thank you very much, Stephen, and it's great to be part of this panel. And indeed, I think all the topics that you mentioned actually are interlinked, because I think there's just sort of like an umbrella there which causes this whole discussion, because the regulation itself is not a new thing, So we as ITU, International Telecommunication Union, have been in this business, if you will, since 1963, from just 6 years after the first satellite that was launched in orbit. There was a special space conference, which is, one of our, at that time was specialized conference on radio communications to basically set in motion certain regulations to regulate, especially allocation of spectrum and to distribute orbits as well, to make sure that let's say there is some order in space. But of course, the last few years kind of reignited that debate again, and of course there is a different trends for that, so from new technology, especially from communications perspective, we now mostly, we used to focus mostly on geostationary orbit, but now much more activity and interest is in especially lower Earth orbit, but also middle Earth orbit, with the commercialization of space as well. And that kind of these trends also now driving down the cost of launches, which means many more actors are there. And that also interest in is increasing interest of different private sector actors, but increasing interest of the governments as well, because you mentioned FCC developments and developments in the US, but similar developments are happening all around the world now, from Portugal to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. There's a body is being set up, or at least attention is being paid to how to regulate the space activities and space communications there as well. And there are different aspects to that. So first of all, this question is, especially from the government's perspective, of equitable access, which was a pretty strong principle on geostationary orbit, and we had the whole regime set up there under radio regulations, or the treaty that we, let's say, manage and administer, to make sure that every nation and every country has more or less equal rights to access space. Now, when we come to the non-geostationary orbits, that becomes much more difficult, and that opens that discussion of the new race to kind of get into that orbits and who will be first there. And of course, we see a lot of activities in a few countries, but a lot of other countries are starting to ask that question, will they be too late? And then, especially when it's coupled with the questions which we'll discuss later, such as space debris, because it's not only about how many satellites are there, but also how much cluttered is that orbit. Then, of course, the other aspect is, which I think it becomes important wherever you are, is the market access. Because a lot of pieces, what we discussed, and I know, for me, when I entered this, was, to understand how different it is, because one thing is to have a regulator in the US, telling whether you can launch or not into orbit. Another thing is also, having a regulators around the world allowing you or not to beam that, that communication and link down to that specific country. And I think sometimes that piece is a little bit forgotten in that big discussion, even though that piece probably needs much more international coordination, because if you have a satellite, but you cannot provide legally services to a number of countries, especially if you want to provide services on a direct-to-user level, that becomes challenging. And already some countries are raising the questions whether their national regulatory rules, let's say, are being ignored or not. So, of course, what type of regulation? It's of course, like in here in the space probably is one of the area, but some regulation, is necessary, because even for the private sector actors, because it reduces the uncertainty, and through that we hope reduces the costs. and then kind of allows the longer term investment planning. However, of course, regulation needs to be flexible enough and reviewed continuously. From our perspective, it's very important, and it involves how we create regulation involves different actors, including public and private sector. And here in ITU, we're a pretty unique UN agency because we have member states, but we have also key private sector players, especially most of the satellite companies, as well as our membership. But also around in a globalist aspect, because I think the space is definitely shared commons, and especially when we talk about low Earth orbit, middle Earth orbit, it's become even more shared commons, because even if it's just stationary orbit, you can say it hangs among, above ourselves. Geostationary orbits and non-geostationary orbits are by definition, like global commons, and how we manage that together is super important. And I think these questions, will have to be answered, including today. And the last thing is also, of course, it's very important that we base it on a sound technical expertise and not only on political aspects. Now, to tell you just the last piece is now becoming of the global importance. In the UN broader, we have this process called our common agenda process, which will be finalized next year with so-called Summit of the Future. And one of the key pillars of that process is actually space policy and space use. And Secretary General Antonio Guterres has launched just a few weeks ago so-called policy brief on future outer space governance, which tackles a lot of those topics that we kind of talking here today, and actually calls for action in the coming years to make sure that this space, for the lack of a better word, is well governed. And I think that's why it will be very important that we look at that issue, not only from the national perspective, but recognize that unless we start early looking into national perspective, we'll quickly find ourselves, very much locked in our views, even, however big or small the country it is. So thanks a lot.
Excellent, Thomas, very much appreciated. Abhishek, maybe we can turn to you for your perspective.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Tamara and SSPI for having me over for this session. So, the international perspective and the US perspective and policy and the introduction that we got today gives a background to where exactly regulation is headed and where we are at in the different spheres, at least at the international or specific municipal sort of level. So I'd like to concentrate on specifically on India, because that's where I'm most sort of conversant with the regulatory framework. And, it's over the last about 7 or 8 years, I've been attending these webinars and some conferences in person. And every time there is a question that is put to me as to what really is the framework, regulatory or policy or otherwise in India, and there would always be a kind of a sheepish response to say, look, it's a work in progress. There is a policy in place since 2001. It's not really very transparent, but we are there are authorizations being granted. There is utilization of space objects, and overall, the ISRO has a great international standing with regard to the kind of work that it has been able to do. But I'm very happy to sort of, if this audience already is not aware, very happy to share that in April of this year, we've had an announcement of a new Spacecom policy, which was released in that month. And it's a fairly, it's not a very detailed document and specifics as any policy document need not be. The detail, of course, is in the guidelines or in the specifics of perhaps a legislation which we've all been pushing for quite a while. But the policy document for the first time does the following things. First, if I can call it, the so-called sort of monopoly or hegemony of ISRO has really been broken up, and ISRO really, as the term goes, Indian Space and Research Organization, its role has been restricted to research and development and utilization of technology, licensing of technology from non-governmental entities or to those entities, and overall development of the research and development area. The NSIL, which is the New Space India Limited, which is the commercial arm, is tasked with the responsibility of commercial exploitation of some of the technologies that are developing. But most importantly, a new entity that came into being in 2020, but really has gathered steam in the last little over a year called InSpace, which is the Indian National Space Promotion and Authorization Center, has been given the maximum responsibility and sort of accountability for promotion of space activities in India. And I think a lot of that push has come from the burgeoning startup sort of ecosystem, which has really propelled the non-governmental entities in India to perhaps the international stage, and got them to create an independent sort of existence for themselves, an independent voice in the economy, and specifically in the space economy, for the policy to be moderated, for the policy to be a more open-ended, sort of and forward-thinking sort of document, and of course moving towards a situation where we are expecting an updated foreign direct investment policy, specifically catering to the space sector. So the level of regulation that currently exists further to this policy, and it's still, I mean, as I said, the policy document is just a parent document. It has to really sort of develop into subsets or guidelines and what have you, to really frame the contours and go into the specifics of what a business should be looking at when it intends to operate in the Indian economy. We do, however, have a distinct policy and guidelines on remote sensing, which were notified late last year. We do have a separate set of regulations governing the flight and maritime connectivity rules. And we do have an ongoing consultation process to decide on the specifics of allocation of satellite spectrum. And there is, perhaps if some of you have been following the debate in India, whereas it seems at least that the newer age space entities and also the regulators seem to want to foster competition, and with that in mind, and keeping the international trends in perspective, they are moving towards or advocating an allocation through an administrative route, through a registration process, etc. However, the incumbent telecom operators have been advocating an auction route, and the Department of Telecom is also ambivalent as to whether or not it should go for the auction route or for the administrative allocation. The debate also seems to be that since there was this landmark case of the Supreme Court of India, where in case of terrestrial spectrum allocation, the Supreme Court came down very heavily on an executive decision to grant that spectrum on a first come, first served basis. And they said that ordinarily auction should be an auction discovered price should be the best way of allocating such natural resources. That is being read by some quarters to say that, look, if it talks about allocation of spectrum and a preferred methodology being auction, then it should equally apply, as it applies to terrestrial spectrum, it should equally apply to the satellite spectrum, not understanding the huge distinction between the two and the international perspectives that that get involved in these dialogues and processes. So very, in a nutshell, to summarize, I think we are at the cusp of some amount of regulation in India to bring about some amount of clarity as to how a business is to look towards setting up and operating in this sphere. And I think it's only opportune for this moment to then develop into something which goes into more greater specifics and sets out a clear set of rights and liabilities for the non-governmental entities to be looking forward to engaging in this particular sector.
Excellent, very much appreciated. Let me turn to Rob. Rob, your company, your clients are very interested in this sector. What is your perspective? Does regulation in this area help promote the industry, and how does it help with regard to your risk management profile?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. It's a good question. I mean, maybe I should start off by talking about debris, because it was featured in the video, and I think it's a good place to start because it's an area where regulation could be important. I mean, debris it's a problem in pretty much any orbit, and you have to consider not just man-made debris, but also naturally occurring debris, which is I think, an underappreciated part of the equation. That being said, I don't know if you can really regulate naturally occurring debris. A number of my clients actually have been affected by debris strikes, none of which luckily has caused any more than just a hiccup in performance. But if you get hit in the right or in the wrong place, rather, a total loss it's a credible outcome. So there's really two kind of exposures here that you should consider. One is your first party asset value protection. That's your first line of defense, and really any commercial operator should ensure their spacecraft are on orbit performance. These policies are what's called all risk. That means that they cover any loss, howsoever caused, unless it's excluded, which would be for something like war or willful misconduct, would be standard exclusions you might get. The insurers, to be honest, they're not really that concerned about collision. They might say that they are, but the evidence is to the contrary. They base their premium rates really on the probabilities associated with a technical failure of the satellite. That's electrical propulsion issues, mechanical anomalies, things like that. But debris impact or really any kind of collision, even if it's two entire satellites, are also covered. But it's seen by underwriters as kind of a throw-in coverage, as the likelihood of a collision is considered to be far lower than the likelihood of a technical malfunction. That said, with man-made debris increasing all the time, that balance can shift quite easily. And if collisions increase dramatically, especially if there's high-profile collisions, you could see a point where it becomes a separate coverage, or at a minimum causes a spike in premium rates. The other area, the other type of risk, I should say, would be third-party liability protection, and that's defense against damages caused to third parties. So that emerges with respect to debris. If you are struck and then that strike creates more debris, like we saw in the video. So if some of your debris hits a third-party satellite, you could be held financially responsible. So, one question that arises from this is, how do you determine if the debris strike came from your cloud of debris? There could be ways of tracking it with the proper technology, but that technology right now is probably inadequate to do so, especially because it can only track debris of a certain size in terms of centimeters. So, question regarding the regulatory environment, now that I've gotten all that out off the table, for first-party asset insurance, there's no regulation that I'm aware of that requires it. It's usually purchased at the discretion of a financial division within a company. So it'll be someone like a CFO or treasurer. They will buy the insurance at their discretion, or it might be imposed by their lenders or contractually in some way. The government it's not involved outside of regulating the insurance carriers themselves for financial stability. And obviously that's pretty important. But it's in the United States, it's actually done on the state level, which is probably not the right place for it to be, but that's where it is anyway. So with regards to third-party liability, the insurance requirements imposed by regulators really depends on the jurisdiction. So in the US, you have launch requirements that are covered by the CSLA, but once you're in orbit, there are no requirements whatsoever for third-party liability. So in my opinion, our regulatory system tends to be reactive and not really proactive in most cases. So I personally don't see the requirements arising from being imposed by the government unless some major event like a high-profile collision occurs. I think most operators probably don't seem to be in a rush to have the government impose insurance requirements on them either. The major operators with dozens of satellites in orbit or big LEO constellations, they often do buy third-party liability insurance anyway, but they do it at their discretion. They don't want to have the government forcing them to do so. So they're not really in a rush to have the government step in. In other parts of the world, outside of the US, in the UK and the EU, there are compulsory requirements for third-party liability insurance. And I think eventually it'll come here to the United States. It's just not here yet.
Okay, excellent, much appreciated. So we've started off with communications, which was perhaps all about international coordination and managing scarcity. Rob talked briefly about orbital debris, which was the subject of our video. Let me turn now to imaging, which perhaps is more questions of privacy and national security. Maybe Tomas, we can start with you. What's the ITU's perspective on licensing the use of satellites for imaging? What's the ITU's role, and do we think overall there's too much regulation or not enough?
So I think I'm not the best person to start, Stephen, but with that, because I think ITU doesn't have much role in that space, especially licensing imaging or using the imaging pieces. I think what we kind of more work with some of the agencies is actually using imaging or Earth observation aspects of the satellites to help let's say, meet different challenges that we're working on today, including climate crisis, and making sure that they know that data is accessible for those users, and we're working with other partners within the system on that regard. But I think I will have to defer to more qualified colleagues to talk about regulatory environment for the specific countries in terms of the privacy here. Thank you.
Okay, Crystal, perhaps we can turn to you in the United States, land of the free and the home of the brave, and one of the more regulated countries on the face of the earth. What do you have to offer?
Well, there's a lot of ways to approach that question when it comes to regulation. You know, if we're talking about how we look at, for instance, commercial remote sensing policy, I think we can probably say that it has been sort of, I don't know if over-regulated is the right term, but certainly there have been a number of updates in the last few years that are very much welcomed by the commercial remote sensing industry in order to be able to compete with the rest of the world and to make that happen. And there's still an argument to be made that there's a lot more updating that's in the works, and that some of the holdup on that was perhaps an over concern regarding sort of national security policy. That said, it's always a give and take between those two different realms. And so that's just sort of one example. You know, when it comes to what is too much regulation, I think there are sort of different areas where people are looking. For instance, cybersecurity rules around satellites and space activities is something that is really in an infancy. You know, we're trying to figure out what that means, what is necessary, what governments should be doing, and what companies and other actors are responsible for. And I don't know that anyone has a lot of good answers there yet. We're still trying to understand the risks. And as we've all seen, there are very much risks. The international geopolitical scene very much affects our industry. You know, the capabilities that we have on orbit are something that are put into play in a number of situations around the world and can contribute to those situations in a positive and sometimes in a negative way. And so trying to understand that interaction, I think, between those concerns is really key. I would also point out that how we regulate space can also contribute to geopolitical concerns itself, right? And so when we talk about, for instance, the effects of space weather, which is another topic that's often overlooked, you know, one of the concerns is that if we don't have better understanding of space weather and its effect on space situational awareness, on satellites, and then even on terrestrial industries itself, it makes it much easier to have a misunderstanding. And so there's a lot of facets to this, which is what I was trying to convey there. In terms of some countries, how involved the role of the military is in regulation can vary, but typically that's not what's driving regulation. It's more of a consultative role. It's more of rules and regulations that are designed to protect national assets, that sort of thing. And there you definitely want to continue to see that. But it's always a balance with trying to figure out how to do so and yet not restrict the growth of commercial space industry and more importantly, the applications that come from that. And so sometimes it can be difficult to remember that a lot of what we're doing in space affects terrestrial industries around the world. And it's a key linchpin in how we address global challenges. So whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about trying to make progress on the SDGs, whether we're talking about responding to national disasters or just improving socioeconomic life around the world, that's really key. And so when we think about what we're regulating in these various areas of space activities, it's really important to remember what the goal of a lot of these activities is and the contributions they're making, because that plays a role in how much we regulate, where we take opportunities and risks, where we allow technology and advancements to get out in front a little bit, and where we need to take a stronger role. and protecting, because that's when we talk about space sustainability, for instance, our goal there is we're not protecting the space environment because we think it's cool. Like, we're all here, we all like space, it's really fun, you know, I get excited about it, you know, it's we're enthusiasts, right? That's why part of why we entered the industry. But when we actually talk about protecting the space environment and contributing to space sustainability, it's because of the value that we receive on Earth. And that's something that we sometimes lose sight of. But it's really important when we're talking about whether we have too much regulation or not enough, because it's about making sure that we are finding that balance between encouraging and expanding the use of space for prosperity on Earth, while at the same time making sure that we're not shooting ourselves in the foot at a future date, and that we're causing problems for those same goals. And so I think national security concerns fall into the same set of, you know, these are all the things we need to consider. And that's one of the things that we absolutely need to consider, but it can't be the only one, because, you know, the benefits from space obviously don't just go towards national security, they go to a whole host of activities around the globe.
Excellent, excellent. India is also not known for its underregulation in a number of areas, but Abhishek, maybe you would like to comment on imaging, national security, privacy, and the regulation that India does in this area.
Sure, thanks, Steve. So I had sort of briefly mentioned, I touched upon the aspect that we have a policy around geospatial data and imaging, which was notified in December of last year, 2022. So while there has been a fair amount of growth of commercial entities and enterprises in this particular domain, and they continue to prosper, while there is a little more clarity with this policy document, the basic sort of set of principles was set out in a set of guidelines which came out in February of 2021. And that really set the tone for just easing certain controls. You know, the biggest sort of, I think, highlight of that document was that, unlike prior to that document, where the default proposition was that you needed to take permission when you are engaging in this sort of an activity, now there is only a negative list that is provided, for which permission needs to be given or may not be even given at all in terms of sensitive areas and security issues. But otherwise, the default proposition is that you're able to conduct activities in line with these regulations at a relatively open-ended and a free mechanism. Just sort of touching upon what Crystal also said towards the end, the policy document that was notified in December of last year has a very clear statement on strategy and approach of that policy document. And I read from that, the focus of the policy is to make geospatial technology and data as agents of transformation for achieving the sustainable development goals, bringing efficiency in all sectors of economy, and instilling accountability and transparency at all levels of governance. So that's the underpinning sort of an underlying objective with which this policy has been notified. Certainly, there is an emphasis towards independence of the Indian entities in collecting their own data, creating their maps, and improving the planning and management across these sectors. And that one of the highlights of that document also is it sets out specific goals to be achieved further to this policy in the years 2025, 2030, and 2035, with each set of 5-year period resulting in a greater level of sort of sets of achievements. For example, you know, it's expected that by 2025, this sector should be generating revenues of, you know, it should be valued at over about 8 billion and should be giving employment opportunities to about 1 million people in the country. So with that in mind, the goal of a year 2030, for example, is high resolution topographical survey and mapping of 5 to 10 centimeters for urban and rural areas, and about 50 centimeters to 100 centimeters for forest and wasteland. Then there is an emphasis on development of a geospatial knowledge infrastructure, which should have its underpinning by the integrated data and information network. So framework, sorry. And so there is a very detailed sort of you know, minute aspects that the policy goes into in order to facilitate the growth of of the sector and business. The last point, at this juncture, we don't have a national data protection legislation. So with that in mind, there are some basic underlying principles of data protection that are there in this policy, but I think it's a matter of time. Perhaps we are looking at either the monsoon session, which should happen in a couple of months from now, or maybe at the latest by December, we should have the current bill that is being circulated and on which has been commented upon, placed in Parliament for it to be notified as law. And then perhaps we will have a much better setup to at least address the privacy concerns. The security concerns are already discussed in this particular policy.
Good. Thank you. I think we've got only about 2 minutes left. Let me come back to Rob. And Rob, maybe you can comment on an area we haven't touched yet, but regulation of human space flight and the U.S. policy of informed consent and the possible end of the learning period in October. What is the risk management perspective? Do we need more regulation? Is it time to end that period? What do you think?
It's a good question. That, you know, a lot of the things that I said with respect to debris apply here, where there really isn't any regulation on commercial spaceflight, particularly from an insurance or risk management perspective. It really is in a nascent stage. So, you know, right now, one thing that's being discussed a lot in the market is how to deal with sort of astronaut life insurance, and that could apply to sort of a tourist in space as well. You know, it's really only available in the space insurance market, even though it's sort of a life insurance policy, if you will. And the causal loss has to be some kind of technical failure of the satellite. You know, the rock or the rocket, right? The rocket could blow up, the spacecraft could lose pressure or whatever, and you could have a human life loss as a consequence. And the cost of the insurance, the premium rates are calibrated to that risk, the technical risk of a launch vehicle failure or spacecraft failure. The space insurance market's not currently responding to causes of death unrelated to technical failure. So, you know, the astronaut has a heart attack or they have a stroke or whatever it is. If it's unrelated to a technical failure, not covered at all. Really, to deal with this, there'd have to be a new product developed to deal with this, where you have, you know, the risk of technical failure in addition to the risk of, you know, a natural cause of death, if you will. You'd have to have a product developed by you know, a confluence of life insurers, AD&D, that's accidental death and dismemberment insurers, and space insurers that all have to work in unison to come up with a new product. Right now, there's not enough activity really to warrant the development of a new product of that kind, or really for the insurers to warrant creating a book of business around it. There's just not enough activity. There's not the premium volumes, and they're not going to unlock capacity in order to do that. So I think the time is coming. It's just not here yet. I think you're going to start seeing more and more flights happening, and you know, whether or not the regulators impose insurance requirements on it, I think it remains to be seen. My guess would be that there's not going to be insurance requirements unless you get tourism to the point where it's so cheap that you could have a lot of consumers sort of going up and not, you know, billionaires going up. At that point, the regulators might come in they might step in to protect the consumers, so to speak, which is oftentimes what they do. But I frankly don't see that happening probably the next decade.
Excellent. Well, I think we're ready to go to questions and from our audience about the regulatory bed that we've made here and what happens when we lie in it. But Tamara, take it away.
Sure. So I'm gonna kind of work my way a little bit backwards. Andrew Malater asked the question: is the ITU or anyone else considering development of a database or other overview of all the different national regulatory processes? And so I think that's over to you, Tomas.
Sorry, I'm not a great panelist. Could you repeat the question? Sorry. So
It's okay. Yeah, so the question was, is the ITU or anyone else considering development of a database or other overview of all the different national regulatory processes?
So I wanted to appreciate for the great idea here, you know, so I think we'll definitely be looking into that. Of course, at the moment, a lot of those rules are still being developed, and I imagine a lot of, you know, private advisors. We have a few of those on the panel here, you know, are happy to advise their clients on those market access rules as well, you know. So from our perspective, what we are focusing on is actually helping to share the best practices for the regulators and for them to even understand how to, let's say, unlock those issues. So because at this stage, I think and how to make sure that regulators around the world really understand the difference, especially the difference between geostationary satellite regulation and non-geostationary satellite regulation, which is quite a big difference here. And I think Abhishek was mentioning here, one key difference, for example, on spectrum access, so aspects, which is which when you talk about let's say some, for example, which spectrum assignment rules that can be used practically for non-geostationary satellite market access piece and Earth station piece. It's important to understand for regulators, and it's important to understand for regulators how the Earth segment regulation links with a space segment regulation. So I think at this stage for us is still the stage of building awareness of regulators, and of course, as we do that, hopefully there will be a space to kind of building understanding of the space industry players, what those regulatory frameworks are. But I take very well there, and we'll be looking inside of ITU whether we can usefully do something about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. All of a sudden the chats are lit up. We got a lot of questions. I have to do something. I have to go backwards a step. So I'm going to flag for us that Hoyt asked a question in the chats. Pessoa Lopez has asked a question in the chats. Pratik has asked a question in the chats. We've got a bunch of stuff happening and the chats are kind of blowing up. But before I miss this opportunity, I do need to turn the table over to Mr. Joe Fargnoli, who is our partner here from New York Space Alliance, because he's going to give us a little bit of a summary overview. We call it the New York Minute. Like all New Yorkers, it's probably not actually a minute, but we're going to see how he does. So I'm going to come back to everybody and we can come back. Please stick around if you can, so we can come back to the questions. But Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Tamara, and thanks, Steve, for hosting a great session. I really appreciate the way you chose these 6 topics of communications, imaging, debris, manufacturing and in-orbit refueling, asteroid mining, and human travel. We ended up spending a lot of time on communication and imaging because we were a little more familiar with it. But the model of how we've come from the early 60s to where we are now in communication and imaging can be projected forward into these other areas as well. I really appreciated Crystal representing the perspective of the US and Abhishal representing India, Tomas, the ITU, and Rob was kind of my favorite mentioning the insurance and risk management area because dollars know no national boundaries. One of the most significant comments was that the regulatory regime is slow and it's reactive, right? And part of the reason why we put on the Space Business Roundtable is to create a conversation and maybe try to get a community upwelling of reactive behavior where we can try to move forward and try to shape regulation before either negative things happen or regulation is shaped in a way that we don't think is best for the industry. I always tend to think of these issues historically, and when folks were moving west in their wagons, there was no speed limit established. So at some point we determined that there was a need for a regulation there. I think also, unfortunately, of the situation right now, the Titan submersible, that OceanGate has, brought forward, and the situation of what is the regulatory environment in the deep seas. So we could probably have about 100 of these sessions on the topic of regulation, and I really appreciate Steve bringing these 6 forward. I will leave my little segment here with the question for the group, which is how can this community, you see we've got a number of folks on the line today, very passionate about getting space regulation right. So we allow some of the goals that Abhishal mentioned of, creating a flourishing space environment, driving the space economy, creating a more secure world nationally and internationally. How does the community engage in the process of making sure that we hit that Goldilocks balance of not too much and not too little, as opposed to the community being constantly reactive or even the regulators being reactive to what's happening? I just want to put forward the question for discussion. How do we, the people, get engaged in driving a sane national and international policy on regulation in these 6 areas? And again, human space travel, asteroid mining, manufacturing, debris management. These are the pioneering areas. These are the new areas that are coming about. Common imaging, not perfect, but we're somewhere down the road on those. So I will leave my segment with that question to the group.
All right, well, I am bringing Steve online, and I'm going to give Steve an opportunity to react and call a panelist. Then I have to do some housework. So housekeeping, I guess that's the way they say it. So Steve, over to you, because Joe threw a challenge out for us.
Yeah, let me give a little bit of an answer, and then let me look to our panel. Adopting regulation is by its very nature a deliberative process. It is invariably too slow. It is invariably reactive. It's hard to be proactive, but I do think the US, at least with its establishment of the Space Bureau, is focusing a lot more on policy and on trying to stay ahead of the curve. We'll see how they do. Report card can be issued in a couple of years, I would think, but I think at least there is an actual recognition in the US that if we want the industry to develop and if we want the industry to be commercially successful, but as well as responsive to the environment, as well as dealing with issues of national security, as well as handling some new and novel issues, you really have to think ahead and try to not wait till problems arise. And I think that the FCC has tasked itself to do that. Internationally, it's more complicated. I think the ITU itself has got a limited authority to operate in this area, mostly focused on the communication space. And I think some other countries, India is one of them, are also thinking proactively as to what kind of regulation needs to be done. But this is not easy. It's hard to stay ahead of an active industry. It's hard to stay out front when some of these issues haven't been tackled before. But I think an effort is being made, and I think we will see more forward-looking policy going forward. I don't know if Crystal, you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Joe hit on one of the most important points here is that this is a resource issue, because I stand strongly by the statement that overregulation is clearly, would clearly be a problem, but we should not be waiting until we have major incidences in space. It's a fragile environment. This is exquisite machinery, even on, depending on what you're talking about. But this is not an option to just say, well, let's just see and figure it out later. And yes, of course, there needs to be permissiveness. There needs to be the ability to experiment. There needs to be the ability to take risk 100%. But we can't do so in a way that puts other services at risk. We can't do so in a way that puts people at risk. It's this Goldilocks balance between being able to innovate and move forward, but and understand that it's not ever going to be perfectly safe, but not wait until we have a giant problem or another collision, or depending on which area you're talking about. The other thing I would talk about is Joe really said, what can the community do? How can we engage? And it's a really tough problem, because one of the things that I hear from especially newer entrants in the space world is like, we're resource constrained, we're small, we're agile, that's what we're doing to innovate. And so to be able to engage on all of these regulatory issues is really tough. And then you're talking around the world in some cases. And unfortunately, I don't think there's an easy answer there, but I think as a community, we do have to stay up to date on what's happening. We need to engage in the major countries that are going to set the trends for where the regulatory environment moves around the world. So, figuring out places like the United States, the UK, India, et cetera, and really working to engage to say, governments have feedback processes. Don't ignore those. Don't leave those to, the large space organizations who have more resources here. I mean, this has to be a community effort. And again, I think governments are very conscientious of that and are trying to take the time as much as possible to do those consultations, but the industry has to step up. And it's not just the companies themselves, it's the researchers, it's the think tanks, it's everyone who's contributing to a better understanding of what the different solutions look like, which ones can and should be handled via regulation, and which ones can be handled through the host of other areas such as insurance, such as standards, such as industry best practice, set internally. I mean, there's all sorts of things that will contribute to what we're trying to achieve here, but we can only do that if everyone's actually participating and speaking up and talking to each other. One of the biggest problems that we see is not being able to have those consultations, is not being able to participate in those conversations or just not talking to each other, sort of saying like sticking to your lane and just doing that one little thing. But these things are all interrelated. And so unfortunately, I don't have a magic wand to say, well, this is how the community can do that. But I think Joe absolutely hit on one of the most important points, is that it has to be a two-way engagement. You know, don't wait on government to make all those decisions. The community absolutely needs to be getting out there in front of many of these issues and coming at it from how can we all benefit perspective, and not just, you know, what is my one little thing that I'm trying to achieve today.
Crystal, what I hear you saying is that everyone should continue to come to the New York Space Business Roundtable as the forum in which we can tackle these difficult issues.
I think that's exactly
There
what
you
you
go.
said.
Exactly.
Okay, folks, I'm interrupting very rudely, and I apologize, but we are actually over time, and I do have to do a little bit of housekeeping. As I said, oh my gosh, this has been an amazing conversation, and we have proven to ourselves that, my goodness, we need at least 3 or 4 more in order to effectively tackle this topic. But let me do a quick announcements, please. Starting with tomorrow, SSPI Wise will be having a closed meeting. So that means that anyone in the industry who identifies as a woman is welcome to join us tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. We will be talking about what SSPI Wise is looking forward to in the upcoming year. And more importantly, we'll be having an opportunity for people to get involved and participate in our working groups. By the way, nominations are currently open. We are currently taking nominations for the 20 under 35 and Mentor of the Year. That's due July 17th. Folks, Crystal Hazelton, Rob Shiga, both of them came through this process. We are so proud of them and so happy to have them. Please submit nominations for more people like them who are going to be leaders in our industry. And if your company is doing something amazing, something that the world needs to know about, and you want us to tell your best story, please submit for the Better Satellite World Awards nominations. So those are due in September. Next month is the 3rd quarter. We will be kicking off a brand new series here at the Roundtable, Profits and Justice in the New World. Please stay tuned for more information about that. You'll be hearing from me, of course, by email, maybe too many emails. I apologize in advance, but seriously, we're looking forward to the conversation. And with that, I have exactly room for one more question. So I'm going to ask Hoyt's question, if I may, and I'll call Steve back onto screen. But Hoyt asks, for GEO, ITU, and national regulatory authorities like FCC grant licenses for a specific location and space for the use of specified frequencies and GSOs, it would seem licenses will need to be exclusive across all frequencies and applications for a given spherical shell in Earth orbit to ensure sustainability and reduce satellite collision risk and debris. Are there any consideration at these regulatory bodies as to what amount of separation by orbital altitude will be needed? Might there be a point in the future where elliptical orbits might not even be allowed, given the greater number of potential conjunctions with other constellations? That's a scary thought. Steve, I'm bringing you back online.
Well, let me give a brief comment, and maybe we can finish with Tomas to get his view. Hoyt's picked up on an important issue, which is that we try to license as best we can based on the technology as it exists today, but it changes, and people have expectations going forward that they'll continue to have licenses in use, but the regulators also need the flexibility to change the regulatory structure as the technology gets better and better, and that changes in various ways. So we do need to be able to revisit these. It's hard to write that into your license, so to speak, but it is an important issue. If we want to be efficient, if we want to allow for maximum participation, we do need to be able to revisit these issues and rejigger things as the technology changes. But Tomas, I think this is right up your alley. Maybe you'd like to comment.
Yes, thank you very much, Steve. And that's great indeed question. And I think, that's exactly the question that symbolizes the state of the regulatory environment and market development environment where we are. With geostationary satellites, we kind of have it figured out. We have a registration, we know how to allocate the resource more or less and all that. With with the lower Earth orbits, and middle Earth orbits, satellite orbits, we're still figuring it out. And I think this is an early stage. We have a registration system, so we kind of know what's happening or what is supposed to happen in the future. But a lot of that coordination is still, is still, let's say, for the space players to do. And initially, of course, we have only a few major space players, so that's kind of not a big issue. But I think increasingly, as the space becomes democratized, because more space players are coming in, but also as other players, including countries, are starting to see, hey, like we also will want to have an access. Those questions will exactly arise: how to kind of find a good way to balance, let's say, first move advantage and ability, and allowing to the space those who can invest with ability for others to follow and still have a possibility to be there. I don't think we have yet clear answers there. And of course, if fellow panelists have those, it will be great to hear. But I think it's clearly something we are now very actively thinking, and I'd have to say a lot of discussions internationally are starting on that regard. But it also illustrates that there are other technological aspects that are still developing, like, for example, space-to-space communication, which is now removes the need of kind of dropping off the traffic down to the Earth, and kind of with a lot of implications, including the privacy and security and jurisdictional aspects as well, So just today, actually, just like an hour before this call, got an announcement from one of the company about successful trial or direct-to-mobile device kind of communication, which raises a whole host of issues that we are grappling in. For example, how terrestrial frequencies can be used for the spectrum communications and other things. And I think that's where there's still, I think, is a huge, and now coming back to this question, how everyone can contribute, I think there's still a huge huge possibility and need to kind of build our understanding. What is the technology, so that that regulatory environment kind of is able to at least match that or keep up with that, and then to build capabilities of the regulators to understand what's happening, because that's, I think, we're still in that stage where I think we shouldn't overestimate how much regulators still need, or underestimate how much regulators still need that understanding. Now, we would invite all the stakeholders to contribute. This roundtable today is a great opportunity. We, of course, as you mentioned, have a certain mandate of ours in that area. However, we collaborate with others, including with the Committee of Peaceful Users of Outer Space, which is another agency, let's say, that tasks for some areas. We have within UN called UN Space, or it's an interagency group on outer space issues among UN agencies to kind of bring these issues together. And we're now being challenged by UN Secretary General and the broader community to figure out the right governance mechanisms across the board. So, of course, this input from experts, both technical experts and regulatory experts, would be super useful here as those questions are still very much evolving. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Listen, can everybody please join me in giving an applause virtually to our panelists, and especially to our guest moderator, Mr. Steve Kaufman. Gosh, I wish we could continue, but we are at 1:14. Steve, last word to you before I shut the Zoom off.
Thank you, everybody. I think this has been a fascinating discussion. I think I would like to schedule some more sessions. This is an area that certainly deserves a lot of time and attention. Thanks to our audience for listening, and thanks again to the panel for your excellent thoughts.
Thank you all, and have a great rest of today.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Thank you.